What if the most important thing about the Society for Ecological Restoration's new standards isn't the addition of one word or a new framework or even the expanded guidance? What if the real story is what these standards reveal about us? Because standards don't just describe ecosystems, they capture our profession in motion. They show what we've learned, what we're still wrestling with, and the kinds of questions we think are worth asking. Today, I'd like to share a few reflections from reading the new third edition and why I think it says as much about people as it does about restoration. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick, your host. I'm podcasting from Puyallup Territory, also known as Grid City, Tacoma, Washington. This is the podcast about ecological restoration, and this is the episode about what the new restoration standards reveal. Whether you're joining me on a walk through your neighborhood, commuting to work, cooking a meal, thank you for spending a little time with me today. I truly appreciate everyone who continues to listen and share the podcast. It reminds me that restoration is, at its heart, a community. I'd also like to plug Madrone Grove Adaptation and Restoration. It's my little consulting business that's helping to advance climate-ready restoration around Puget Sound. Today is a little different. Today I'd like to zoom out and talk about something a tad philosophical, how our profession learns. Looking back on things, when I first started into restoration in the late 1990s as an AmeriCorps member, I certainly wasn't thinking about professional standards. I was planting trees along streams, stabilizing eroding banks, pulling weeds, and trying to help damaged places begin to heal. A few years later, during my Peace Corps service, restoration looked completely different. It wasn't something separate from people's lives. It was intertwined with livelihoods, food security, culture, and local knowledge. Then, in graduate school, I came across the Society for Ecological Restoration's primer on ecological restoration. I was supposed to give my classmates a 15-minute presentation about it. I talked for nearly an hour, so failed at time limits, but apparently some things never changed. That little primer became something of a compass for me. And 20 years later, SCR has released the third edition of the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. Reading it felt less like opening a new manual and more like catching up with an old friend. The science has certainly advanced, but what struck me most wasn't about the science. It was how much the profession itself has matured over multiple decades. So every profession eventually reaches a point where it tries to answer the same question. What does good practice actually look like? Medicine has clinical guidelines. Engineering continually updates building codes as materials and environmental realities change. As an arborist, too, we rely on the ANSI A300 standards and best management practices from the International Society of Arboriculture. Those guiding documents that professions adopt aren't there to eliminate creativity. They're communities of practice saying, based on everything we've learned together, that is our current understanding of good work. Ecological restoration is no different. In fact, one of the reasons I've always valued the Society for Ecological Restoration is that it has become my philosophical, ethical, and practical home within restoration. That doesn't mean I'm not curiously skeptical about some things SCR does, but a few years ago, I had the privilege of serving on the committee that developed SCR's Code of Ethics, and that experience reinforced something I had already begun to suspect. Good restoration isn't defined only by ecological outcomes. It's also defined by humility, integrity, transparency, accountability, and relationships. So revisiting the 2004 primer today, it reads like a love letter from a young profession trying to discover itself. And the third edition feels more like a constitution for a profession that's growing up. Many of the ideas we think of as recent innovations were already there 20 years ago. Ecological trajectories, indigenous knowledge, cultural landscapes, and the recognition that restoration happens within today's realities rather than some frozen moment in history. What has changed isn't simply the science, it's the scale of the conversation. The standards no longer read like ecologists talking primarily to other ecologists. They now speak to governments, indigenous nations, planners, community organizers, policymakers, funders, and practitioners working everywhere from neighborhood parks to tropical forests. I don't think it's possible to understand that shift without talking about the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. The last several years have challenged all of us to think more broadly about restoration, not simply as repairing ecosystems, but as work connected to biodiversity, climate adaptation, human health, livelihoods, and justice. You can feel these conversations echoing throughout the new standards. Rather than walking through every revision, I found myself returning to 4 themes. First, restoration has become more people-centered. The document places greater emphasis on communities, rights holders, livelihoods, and meaningful participation. That's an important evolution because restoration has never really just been about the natural world without people in it. Second, it's become more climate ready. I especially appreciated the continued guidance on seed sourcing and climate-informed provenancing. As someone who spends a lot of time selecting plant material, I found that appendix, which appeared in previous editions, it's one of the more practical pieces of the document. Third, restoration has become more accountable. Better monitoring, clearer performance standards, and the social benefits wheel recognizes that success isn't simply about counting surviving trees, it's also about understanding how restoration benefits people. Finally, the profession is becoming a larger public enterprise. The expanded discussions around financing, certification, and monitoring suggest that restoration is increasingly part of public policy, investment, and governance, not just the ecological practice. Those developments bring tremendous opportunities. They also bring important questions in my mind. Of the 8 principles, I always return to the first 4. They tell a story that begins with people. It draws on different knowledge systems. It remains grounded in the identity of place, and it ultimately supports nature's own capacity to recover. One sentence from my notes has stayed with me ever since I finished reading the document. Communities rarely experience restoration through our reports or conference presentations. They experience it through the choices we make on the ground. Sometimes they see hope. Unfortunately, sometimes they see harm. Sometimes they see something entirely different than what we intended. That doesn't mean every criticism is correct, but it also reminds me that restoration is always a practice of listening. As I finish reading these standards, I find myself reflecting on this edition and also kind of fantasizing about the next one. Standards don't write themselves, people do. There's a whole committee of talented folks out there that put this document together. They reflect the experiences, values, and perspectives of those willing to wrestle with difficult questions together. Every generation inherits their profession, asks new questions, and hopefully leaves it a little different than they found it. I hope the 4th edition continues that tradition. I hope it includes even more voices, more Indigenous leadership, urban practitioners, community organizers, young folks, more people willing to challenge assumptions, including their own, because that's how professions grow. So when I first discovered SCR's primer as a graduate student, I thought it was teaching me how to restore ecosystems. 20 years later, I realized it has also been teaching me something much bigger. It has been showing me how communities of practice learn, not by always agreeing, not by defending every tradition, but by remaining curious enough to incorporate new science, new voices, new experience, and new ways of seeing the world while holding onto the values that matter most. If today's short conversation sparked your interest, I've written a much more detailed companion essay on Grit and Grow's Substack, where I take a deeper dive into the new standards, compare them with some earlier editions, and reflect on what they might mean for the future of ecological restoration. You'll find a link in the show notes, along with the links to the Society for Ecological Restoration and the 3rd edition itself. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for the work you're doing in your own communities, and thank you for being part of this growing restoration community. Until next time, take good care of yourselves, take care of one another. See you in the woods.